Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final panel of the day, Environmental Justice Journalism. And we have a panel of distinguished North Carolina environmental journalists here. So while we just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the environmental justice movement, environmental justice itself has lagged behind and even sometimes seems to be invisible for the people and communities on the front lines. That's changing, albeit not as quickly as we'd like, but thanks in large part to the growth of environmental justice reporting, which after being overlooked is becoming more mainstream. Many newsrooms are now covering climate, environment, and environmental justice as a beat. That's why we modified the title of this panel to include a line frequently used by Bob Bullard, considered the father of environmental justice movement, to title this summit From Footnotes to Headlines. So environmental justice reporting seeks to hold industries, governments, and systems to account and report on vulnerable communities impacted by climate or environmental disasters. Environmental justice reporting covers everything from race and housing to health care and immigration, and last but not least, climate justice. We know that climate change affects all of us, but it does not affect all of us equally. As more journalists report on environmental issues, it's critical that they shine a light on the heightened consequences our deteriorating environment has on vulnerable communities. So we have a panel of 4 distinguished journalists here, and I'll introduce them briefly, and they'll each talk about their work. Will Atwater is a native North Carolinian. Will grew up in Chapel Hill and has spent the past decade working with educators, artists, and community-based organizations as a short-form documentary and promotional video producer. He now splits his time between North Carolina and New Jersey, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. Will was also a 2023 fellow for the Wake Forest Environmental and Epistemic Justice Journalism Program.
Late in the day, my fault.
I know I kind of sprang that on me at the last minute. Ella Klein is a WFU sophomore. She's a student and editor of the environmental section for the Old Gold and Black. And Ella chronicled the after effects of the Weaver fire. She's a native of Winston-Salem. Cornwell Watson describes himself as a dope-ass black photojournalist, living his best life. So he started his photography journey by asking his partner once a week if he could buy a new camera, a nice camera, prior to their first child being born. Eventually she said yes, and the next day, thanks to Amazon, a beautiful new camera was on his doorstep, and it's been unreal ever since. His photography has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, including his project about Black experience titled Behind the Mask. And this is an announcement Cornell knows, but no one else does. He's also a 2024 Wake Forest EEJI fellow, journalism fellow. And Lisa Sorg probably wouldn't describe herself as a dope-ass white investigative. But she is.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. So she is also an adjunct professor of journalism here at Wake Forest, and she's assistant editor and environmental reporter at NC Newsline. and she helps manage the newsroom operations, while also covering the environment, climate, agriculture, and energy. So she has a lot on her plate. But I wanted to start with them talking about their work, and so we'll start with Will.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'm Will Atwater. I'm the environmental health reporter at North Carolina Health News, and I've been there for 2 years, and prior to these 2 years, I kind of knew nothing really about environmental health. And well, I live in the world, so scratch that. I did, but I've never really reported on those kind of things, is what I'm trying to say. So learning about really important issues in North Carolina, like forever chemicals, it has been like a master's class on steroids for me to kind of catch up with all this stuff. So should I be clicking this? Okay. All right. So here's some. Let me back up. And so here's some of the things I've covered. This is the Warren County, the 40th anniversary of the Warren County PCB protest that happened a couple of years ago. That fortunately I was able to participate in, cover that. So that was interesting. This we all know on some level about forever chemicals and been in the news a lot lately. Actually, you know, for 7 years have been in the news, but it seems like in the last couple of weeks or so, really, the news about that has sped up. So this was a protest that was happening right outside of the Chemours plant, in the Fayetteville Works plant, back in the fall. And I also cover, so my work is environmental reporting, but environmental justice is also really baked into all of that. So this was a Black Alliance meeting that happened back in the winter that I covered. And another, you know, obviously forever chemicals and PFAS takes on many layers, and part of one of the issues in the fire service, they're dealing with trying to figure out if they can protect fire workers by developing new PPE that does not have forever chemicals. So that remains to be seen. So this is something that is ongoing that I report on. And these are, we all recognize these things, our buddies. You know, CAFOs, Big Ag is something that's very important to the state, and it also is a source of a lot of environmental issues. And Sherry White Williamson was speaking about some of the stuff that happens around this in Sampson County, obviously in Duplin County as well. And this is from Tom Butler is a farmer who has been very supportive of environmental issues and environmental harms that have impacted people because of hog farmings and hog lagoons. And so this image is from his farm when I met with him maybe a year and a half ago, I think. So I guess in conclusion, my work, again, kind of flows, but I think a lot of it, and I think Kemp said it best, for me, it's hard to pull apart or dissect what is environmental justice and separately from what is, environmentalism or environmental reporting. Especially in this state, for me, it seems like it definitely overlaps and is interwoven. So I'll leave it at that.
Ella?
Hi, I'm Ella Klein. I'm the environmental editor for the Old Gold and Black, which is Wake Forest University's student-run newspaper. That's not us.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I hit it when it was a blank. Sorry.
That's nice. I joined the staff in September of last year, so I've only been a journalist for like 8 months. so go easy. We have, luckily, a whole environment section, which is unique for a newspaper, especially a student-run one, and it's really great. I'm really happy to be there, and I have a wonderful co-editor and a staff that helps me out. But why I'm here is because I did the reporting on the 2-year after effects of the Weaver fire, which started out as a 500-word assignment from my editor, where she was like, whoa, where she was like, please just do a recap, because we've done one every year, as half of Wake campus was evacuated, and we were in that ward. So I talked to Professor Myberg here first about it, and he led me to Crystal Dixon, who's a wonderful professor, and then she led me to talking to Dee Dee Adams, who's the 9th Ward Councilwoman. And from there, I started looking into some 990s and some budget things, and I think if you're a reporter or just do a lot of Googling, you can really get yourself down a rabbit hole. So that's what I did, and it turned into a pretty long investigative story. I was supposed to have it done by like January 20th, and it ended up being done February like 20th or something like that. And in that, it was kind of hard to report on because not a lot of people want to talk to a student journalist or really take a student journalist seriously, especially because a lot of people thought I was just like doing it for a class, not for the Old Gold and Black. And then it got picked up by Newsline and other publications like Triad City Beat. And so I had some like angry emails being like, hey, I thought this was for a class project. What? And I was like, oops, sorry. But yeah, I'm a Winston-Salem local, so I grew up here, and I've seen the injustices in Winston-Salem and seen the after effects of redlining and environmental racism on our community. So I took a new angle for the story of talking about how the structure of Winston-Salem aids and abets environmental racism, especially when it came to the Weaver fire. This is a DEQ map, and it's hazardous waste sites in conjunction with majority minority and low-income block groups, which means that Winston-Salem is actively polluting Black and brown and poor communities. And so I talked a bit about that in my article, and then went on to talk about the misuse of city funding and money, which is just a constant Winston-Salem pattern, unfortunately. Yeah, and that's it. You can read the article, but it was a tough one to write, but I ended up getting people to take me seriously, and I had a lot of help from my editors and my staff, which was really nice.
Good afternoon. My name is Cornwell Watson. As mentioned, I'm a dope-ass Black photographer, born and raised in North Carolina, and my short story of my photography career, as mentioned, was I got a camera because I wanted to take photos of my daughter right before she was born, and then in 2020, I stumbled into photojournalism, and the way that I stumbled also into environmental and justice reporting was actually via NC Clean Air. I got an email, and they were like, hey, would you like to do a photo presentation? And I was like, sure. I was like, on what? And it was like, well, we got a couple different issues, and like it was like a laundry list of issues in North Carolina. And one of them was about Sampson County, which is how I met Sherry White Williamson. And so I forgot to click here. So here are some of the outlets that I have published photos with, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the stories that I've worked on. So like I mentioned, Sampson County was one of the first issues that I learned about, and that's kind of how I got my feet wet with environmental and justice reporting. This is the landfill in Sampson County. And as mentioned earlier, one of the byproducts of the landfill is also the pollution from the trucks that line up constantly throughout the day. Also in this photo, you can actually see a CAFO, a hog farm that's in the back, and the open air lagoons that Kemp talked about earlier. That is literally all in one single place. One of the things about photojournalism is I get to spend a lot of time with people and connecting the issue of environmental issues to the people. This is one of the people that lives in the Snow Hill community, literally standing in his front yard looking at the line of trucks at the top of the landfill hill. This is also the animals that are nearby, so think about all the products that are in the landfill. DuPont had been cited for dumping PFAS out in the landfill at one point. So you also have to think about that the animals eat from the land as well, then eventually they end up on our dinner tables. I photographed this for the Southern Environmental Law Center, but they were teaching residents about hog farm operations. And then this is Ella Mae White, who also lives in Snow Hill. And one of the interesting things about this photo is that when I met her in her home, she was actually looking at her bills, and she had pulled out her water bill. And she was like, I don't really understand why I pay a water bill, because she spends so much money in actual filtered water. As you can see, she's got like that big, huge water cooler sitting right in her kitchen. And then another community in North Carolina is the Rogers Eubanks community, Rogers Road. Reverend Campbell, I photographed here in a conceptual photo about how they overcame the landfill issue there. We talked about Baden, West Baden, North Carolina, back here in Alcoa with Macy Henson. Here's a waste bin in the Alcoa site. Macy Henson, who's one of the residents of West Baden. PFAS we've talked about. Y'all touched on a lot of issues. This is Emily Donovan at the PFAS conference 2 years ago talking about the Chemours PFAS contaminants in the water. Carolyn Olinger at the river. And then this was actually a parade out in near the Eno River about keeping the waters clean. One of the other things that I don't think has been touched on here, and actually this is a story that Lisa broke about lead in the soil of playgrounds in Durham, North Carolina. The ecology of birds due to racism and environmental injustice, and there's a whole conversation around that and how that impacts our ecosystems. Climate resiliency in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the power grid, and how that predominantly impacts a lot of communities of color there. And then this is a story about climate change and sea level rise out in the coastal parts of North Carolina and Hyde County, where there's a black community that sits really close to the wetland areas, where they are impacted by sea level rise. They experience sunny day flooding, which is flooding that happens when there isn't any rain happening. And then we've talked about this a lot today, but Enviva and the wood pellets. And this is an aerial shot that I took. This is out in Garrisburg, or Northampton County, North Carolina. And this was actually on a slow day too. There were only a few trucks, and you can just see the scale of how many logs or trees that have been cut down and is lined up. And this is like a tiny portion of the yard on that particular day. And then this is one of the families that live a rock's throw away. Like, it's right behind the tree line is the Enviva plant. And one of the positive things that has happened recently is with the PFAS having some federal regulation around it. And so this just happened a couple weeks ago. So, excited to talk about photojournalism and how photojournalism is also journalism.
I'm Lisa Sorg, the dope-ass white former high school guard that back when short white girls could play in high school varsity teams. Sometimes I just feel so tiny compared to everybody now. But I wake up every morning in a state of simmering rage and think about all the people who are suffering from either active pollution, active, I would say malice, or negligence. And so my job at Newsline is to investigate the, bad guys. I also do, some more routine stuff. Like today I had to write about the Executive Order 80 and how far the state has or has not gone on its climate goals. But most of the time I am trying to find wrongdoing and uncover it. And also just in some cases it's education, like this story. And I just pulled these, randomly. But environmental justice is a huge part of my work, and that's how I see every story, really, is through that lens. So this one is about, the fact that private wells, I grew up on a private well in rural Indiana, and, our water was clean, I think. I was born with an extra tooth. Maybe not. But anyway, but how income and race can often determine whether you have clean water. This is the story, and this is an ongoing nightmare, actually, in Durham. And I have some things to say about incinerators and parks. There are 5 parks in Durham that there used to be a municipal incinerators there. It was a very common way in the early part of the 20th century to dispose of waste, was just to take it to black neighborhoods and burn it. And they used coal, so there's probably coal ash contamination on these sites. This is a site in East Durham. As you can see, that green area is contaminated with lead, and that building behind it is an apartment building. And there are young children who live there because I saw them. But this is a statewide issue. In fact, I am working on some follow-ups. This happened in Greensboro as well, in Bingham Park, where they're having to clean up a landfill and waste from a municipal incinerator. And I haven't really talked about this openly because it was a story I'm working on, but I'm trusting that no one's going to steal it. There was an incinerator at 13th and Underwood in Winston-Salem. What I'm trying to figure out now is whether it was on the north side or the south side of Peters Creek. It was near the city Atwater. In fact, there's a street there called Atwater Street, in case you just... An abattoir is a slaughterhouse. Right. It's a fancy French word for killing animals. And right now, I asked the city if they'd ever tested that area, and they said no. And right now they're excavating part of it for some kind of infrastructure project. So I don't know if the lead has been removed accidentally or which side it's on. I have to do some more due diligence about that. But it's in a low-income neighborhood, and it's near the it's near a housing authority complex, 13th and Underwood. And so I'm looking into that. And there was also some incinerators that operated in Charlotte. So this, I think, is a much bigger problem than just in Greensboro or Durham, and I think it's something that the cities are going to have to reckon with, especially once I find out where they all were. And I just was on a call last night where Durham is going to be fencing off more property in the parks because they found additional contamination. This is a story about Robeson County, which was the worst county until Sherry got word that Sampson is the worst county. But it was a series, it was grant funded, and I did a series of pieces about biogas and water. And there was a company there that wanted to actually have a bombing range in a swamp. And literally the name of the company was called A Lotta Bang. And I thought, aren't you cute? It did not happen, because the Robeson County Commissioner said no. Speaking of Sampson County, one of the things that happens a lot, and it's a project I'll be working on this year, is that we like to ship our waste to communities of color. But unfortunately, the EPA even likes to shift waste from one black community to another black community. And they tried to do this in Sampson County, by taking waste from a Superfund site in Navassa and moving it to Sampson. Well, they said, we're not going to do it because Sherry led the charge and they had pitchforks and torches and were very... Rawr. But I remember this meeting where they were going to say, okay, this is what we're going to do with the waste now. We're not going to transport it to Sampson. And they said, oh, but we have done it before. So, liar, liar, pants on fire. This is a story that I have done at least 25 stories about the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and they are also known as Rebuild North Carolina. They have, and I'm not going to mince words, there's no point in it after 25 stories, they have bungled through their malfeasance and their absolute incompetence the rehousing of people who were devastated by Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. There are still, they stranded people in hotels for almost 4 years. Thousands of people without homes, and now they've accelerated the pace of the, after years, because of our stories and because of other scrutiny, but now the houses are being done so quickly that they're falling apart. This is one of the greatest failures that I have seen in state government in 30 years of reporting. And the person in charge her name is Laura Hogshead, and she's still employed. Despite my best efforts, of reporting the truth. This was a story I also did about the Weber fertilizer fire, and because there was a lot of local coverage, I decided to do some other digging. I found out that, for example, I looked at the building records, and that it was a wooden building that did not have sprinklers because of a loophole in the state building code, and it was falling apart. I got photos from the Department of Labor, and so, what could go wrong? Storing ammonium nitrate in a wooden building without sprinklers. Seriously. And then it also turned out that someone had died on the property earlier, like in the early aughts. He was a worker and he had been electrocuted and died. And the Department of Labor, I think, fined Weaver maybe $7,000. So that's what a life is worth in the state of North Carolina. This is why I'm in a state of simmering rage. That might be it. The last thing I do want to say, and this story actually came out after I had pulled my screenshots, is that there is an old missile plant in Burlington, not that far from here, and it's called the Tar Heel Army Missile Plant. And this is an example of negligence more than malfeasance, and it's in a black and brown community. And when I say the plant would be that back wall, and this would be my house. It's a monstrosity. It's full of contamination, and the military is responsible for cleaning up what's below the ground. And they found out in June of 2023 that there were forever chemicals, PFAS, in the groundwater that are migrating off-site, and they never told the state. And I got the document, and I told the state, and they were embarrassed, and I'm sorry, it wasn't my intention, talk to the military. But this is how silos work. This is how one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And this is what I mean about negligence. It's just people don't think. They've never been to this neighborhood. These people who live near the plant are the poorest of the poor. Their houses are falling apart. They're owned by slumlords. The only houses that are nice are the few that are owned. A lot of them don't even speak English as their first language. They're immigrants, and no one has reached out to them with even proper translation. So that's what I do every day, is get up and find out who's being wronged, and I try to right it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for your presentation and clear telling of the work that you do, and not just here, but every day. So I wanted this panel to talk about environmental journalism, because that's what I am. I'm an environmental journalist, and it's really important to environmental justice. A lot of these stories that you've heard that we've been talking about here, I think probably most of you are familiar with them, but in the general public, so many people don't know. They don't even know what's happening in their own communities. And so that's why this work is important, it's critical. And I have, was general interest reporter and then moved more into health and science. But the environmental, when I started to focus almost exclusively on that, initially I said, is there enough to cover being just an environmental journalist? And somebody said, you remember where you live? Do you know what you do or what you don't do? And I'm like, yeah, so there. And I started there, and there's just like one story after the next, and then bundling also so many stories. And then I'm saying, I need to retire, but the stories keep coming. So that's kind of why we founded and started the Environmental and Epistemic Justice Environmental Journalism Program here to widen the pipeline, to get more reporters covering these things, particularly reporters of color to cover the communities where they come from. And because it's just important to see people who look like, the people in those communities asking these questions and telling these stories. So I'm so happy to have them here talking about this. And I wanted to start with Ella, our cub reporter. It's pretty amazing, though, that the old black and gold, golden black, I always get that confused, kind of really led the reporting on the Weaver fire. I think probably before you were here, because it was so evident what was happening. This is, as Dr. Walker said earlier, the student population, the family population of Wake Forest is one of the wealthiest in the country. And so when that fire happened and that explosion happened, the students here were able to well, I'm gonna go skiing for a couple of weeks, or I'm gonna go do this. But the people who live here were trapped here and had no, just had a hard time getting anyone to come in and take seriously how they were being impacted. And the school newspaper did a brilliant job of highlighting that, and their environmental coverage has, been spot on since. So Ella, tell me how you, when you first started on this story, did you know about it? Did you find what you expected to find? Were you surprised in any way?
Well, to the point of the population of Wake being demographically very drastically different from Winston-Salem, I'm from Winston, and the reporters who led the charge on the first Weaver fire stories that we broke also were from Winston. You'll find if you look in a lot of the staff bios, a lot of our staff are central to North Carolina, because sometimes it's easier to uncover things if you know what's happening. And a lot of, God bless them, but a lot of Wake Forest students don't. They simply don't. But yeah, when I first started the story, as I said, it was a 500-word assignment, and I pretty quickly knew that that was not going to happen at all. I think I told my editor week ago, I was like, no, there's no way I'm getting this down to there's no way. I was here for the Weaver fire not as a student, but as a Winston-Salem resident, which was a very different way to experience the fire than I think it would have been being here. I went to a high school downtown, which you could see the smoke from the fire when we drove to school. They didn't cancel classes. We just kind of sat in our classroom and watched and was oh man, maybe our town's gonna explode. Isn't that crazy? I also ran a youth nonprofit environmental organization at the time, and we had a meeting the day of a block down from where that happened, which was interesting, to say the least. Obviously we couldn't go, but it was interesting. I definitely had never spoken to city officials before. That was
something that was new for me. I started off just talking to Professor Dixon and Professor Myberg here because that's what I was comfortable with at the time. And then I started filling with more and more rage, just bubbling and bursting with it. And I started calling Dee Dee Adams, and I started calling the experiment in self-reliance, which was where the money was, they allocated money for the ESR to give out to citizens who were affected by the Weaver Fire, which was never allocated. And so I called them. I was like, hey, you guys' financial records show you got this much money and you didn't distribute it. And they're like, really? I've never seen our financial records. And I said, what? And they said, could you email them to me? And I said, no. No, I cannot. And that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of like, okay, no one who is reporting on this has like gotten a holistic view at the story. When I was reading the WFDD reports, which were besides the old gold and black, like the people who are most on top of the story, they were great, but they were all very discombobulated. They were all bits and pieces of what I saw as a larger investigative story, which is what I did, was putting bits and pieces together and then like getting blocked by council members and whatever.
I want to add that Ella is one of my students, and so is Shayla in the back, and they are great.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And I know what you mean when you are reporting a story and people want to chase you off or like call the cops on you. That is so like motivating to me. Because you know you're onto something that they don't want you to know, so.
Our photographer, Evan, please raise your hand. Our photographer back there, I sent him to take photos of the site, and him and our designer Jacoby, and they got the cops called on them, and they got chased off the site, which I felt so bad about, but yeah.
Cornell, you being the photojournalist here, and he has a really interesting story. One of the things, you were supposed to have an exhibit at UNC, and they shut it down because they didn't like the context. So he can tell you a little bit about that, but I remember reading about that, and that was pretty drastic and upsetting. But when you go, a picture is worth 1,000 words, they always say, but how do you determine what you're going to shoot? I see people are always people are probably featured more prominently than the sites themselves or the environmental places and themselves, but how do you decide who to shoot and how to frame them and in the context and everything?
It's a loaded question, but so a lot of times, not even a lot of times, all the time, I'm working with another reporter, and it always helps when me and the reporter are aligned and know what the story is. But the other part to kind of like the magic of creating photos is building relationships and trust with the people that I photograph and learning the community that I'm going into. So it matters to have a lot of context about the people and the place and the story. And then I use that information to really just kind of help me tie things together. So I'm always like watching and observing to look at, like the human connection pieces of how does this translate back to, like how does this issue impact the person, and try to really just like create layers and tie that all into one image. Because sometimes you only get one image, and sometimes you get a series of images, but I'm always kind of operating under the fact that I might only get one image in the story, and how do I grab the attention of the viewer and let them know most of this story in this single image.
So, Will, you are the environmental reporter for North Carolina Health News, and you said that was kind of your first major introduction into this. There are so many stories, too many stories to tell in North Carolina. how do you prioritize what you do and when you tell a story?
Well, part of that is driven by my editor. You know, if something is big, like, you know, Forever Chemicals, the EPA announcement, then, you know, I pretty much need to be on that. But otherwise, I look for opportunities to investigate and to share stories about things that are important, but they have not yet been reported on, or they haven't been reported on to a level that I feel like needs to be elevated. And so a lot of these stories I look for, you know, like, I guess not such a good example would be like landfills. Or I mean, you know, the Sampson County landfill is something that has been reported on a lot, but say, you know, the Chapel Hill landfill, and the idea that what I'm driving at is that a lot of people don't know that their landfills are closed, and they're just like these transfer stations, right? So that's, to me, is a big story, and the fact that they end up burdening communities like Sampson County, because so much of our debris ends up there. So, like, understanding, you know, sharing a story about the Chapel Hill landfill and being in Chapel Hill and having people not even realize that you know, their landfill is closed, or in Durham, where, you know, so these kind of stories where, you know, that are important, that draw a bigger connection maybe to a larger story, but we don't really, you know, we're not aware of, like, how deep they are. That makes sense. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Lisa, I want to turn to the reporter who wakes up with rage every morning, and, you know, because she's a short basketball player.
I have a complex.
Yeah, so it's so difficult because so much of this stuff stems from our policies, from the General Assembly and everything, and now, so it's hard to get information, and it's gotten even harder because, you know, the General Assembly, they pass the laws where they can hide their records and they don't have to disclose and everything. So I know you must be a popular person up there in the General Assembly. What's your, do you get like more motivated when they try to block you, and how do you get over those hurdles and decide which injustice you're gonna go after today, because there are so many and the hits just keep on coming?
Right. Well, to answer the records question first, I love records, and you have to know the law, so you memorize General Statute 132, but I file open records requests almost every day. And sometimes it's because I have an idea of something that might be wrong, and sometimes it's just because I'm on a fishing expedition and I want to know. Sometimes people slip me records that maybe I wouldn't already have. It's also a matter of knowing where records are held, and some of them are on public databases. Like there's something called e-manifest at the EPA, where you can track hazardous waste from the source to the destination. And so it takes a little bit of wonkiness to get through that. But records are the backbone of what I do, and they are the backbone of investigative reporting, because they're harder to lie about, because they're right there. When someone, rarely am I denied records now. Sometimes they'll be redacted, and I ask, why did you redact that? I'll give you a couple examples, though, quickly. But for those of you who are student journalists out there, if someone denies you records you should ask the statute under which they're denying you the request, because sometimes they cannot answer that question, which means that you are entitled to those records. Here's an example, though. I got a tip that a giant poultry farm was going to be built in Chatham County on property owned by a state legislator. Now, that state legislator lived far away, but he owned the land. So I knew that, and this particular farmer was applying for a USDA loan. And so I thought, well, that'll be public. So I did get the documents showing the loan, but so much of it was redacted, and I wasn't allowed to know the name of the farmer. And since he didn't own the land, it wasn't obvious. But sometimes people are really bad at redacting. And the name was right there. And I was like, this is amazing. So I guess my advice would be, how I get over it is I file a lot of records requests. If somebody denies me, I challenge them. If people slow walk it, I publicly shame them on Twitter. If they continue to slow walk it, then we sue them, or we threaten to sue. So I hate to go to the nuclear option, but we've had to do it before. And we've not actually had to sue. When I worked at the Indy in Durham, we did sue Governor McCrory over, he would not turn over his travel records. And we did finally get them on December 31st at 4 o'clock on the very last day of his administration. What was your other question? How do I choose which to be maddest about today? I'm actually really, in many ways, a very positive person, but just not about this. Well, I have a list, literally. I have a Google sheet of about 30 stories. And I do triage every day of, what's the most important one. I add to it every day. Today, I have, just sitting here, I've gotten 3 more things I need to think about. High Rock Lake, rural, the USDA thing, and one other thing. So I got to add this to the list. It'll now be 33 stories. So I just try to I try to move at least 5 of them down the road every day. And there are some that I'm waiting, that I haven't gotten a chance to write yet. Environmental justice at the ports, which is a big thing. Sometimes it's got a news peg. Sometimes it's just something that I am curious about. I also find stories in weird ways. That missile plant story, Virginia knows the story because I said it at the panel. I was just driving through Burlington looking for another polluter, and I found this place. Because I do that for fun. So how I choose, it's just what I think I can get done the quickest and what maybe has a sense of urgency, not just in terms of time, but maybe what the public health threat is or the environmental threat is. I wish there were more of us, and I'm teaching environmental journalism next fall to make sure there are more of us, and Melba's running a program now to make sure there are more of us because there are more stories than there are reporters, and there is no end.
So we're going to open it up and have questions. The reporters are going to let you ask us questions. So we're kind of not used to doing that, and so Jeff, please, you had a question.
So one of the things that we grapple with is op-eds, right? From your perspective, respectively, how should we, as we think about it, not being journalists, some of us purportedly good writers, but that's debatable, subjective. How do you see us as environmental entities, nonprofits, being able to do that? Because I look at it as a way, there's a lot going on in the Do Carbon Plan that we've uncovered that the public should be aware of, as an example. And I'm like, yesterday, at my desk at home saying, we need to write op-eds. How should we do that? How should we be thinking about it? What kinds of suggestions would you provide to us on this side of the writer's desk?
Well, my boss, Rob Schofield, runs the opinion side, and he's always up for opinions. So, I think the key is, at least for digital, print might be different, is 800 words, no more. And make it powerful, Make your, you're writing an argument, and so you have a lot more latitude than a reporter has. So I can get you his contact information also, but yeah.
I think I'm going to need the microphone, but maybe you can hear me. You want to drop it?
Nice catch.
Bad throw.
So actually, I'm the qualitative reporter that did the qualitative outcomes for Weaver. And I got tickled when I read your article, Ella, because I wouldn't let you in, so I apologize publicly for that. But it was so that I could make sure that the community members had a safe space to have a conversation. But one of my questions is, as somebody who's working on the publication for that, one of my areas is I always want to try to bridge the research, what I've learned in the research pieces, by telling the story, with the practical aspects of the work. And so my question for you, and of course Crystal's been helping us with this research, so she understands sort of that bridge, but how could we researchers work with journalists, especially with that slant?
Well, I mean, I'm really bad at math. I'm really bad at numbers. I'm horrible at making charts. Making that map, that star thing, that took me a long time. It took me way longer than it should have. It would have taken you 2 minutes. It took me like an hour. But I think that open communication and just knowing that, like, if you have done nothing wrong, there will be nothing for me to report on, you know? And so I have no problem having help or getting help from other people. I love that. I don't like doing all the work myself, honestly. So I think the key to having a good relationship is just communication, talking. I think any reporter, if you're like, hey, I've compiled this data, will be like, oh, thank you, and report on it. I don't think it's that.
And I just want to say, I think what a lot of researchers lose sight of is the story. They like have a lot of numbers and what does that mean? So if you can frame that as a story, then we're always looking for things. The report that Dr. Brown and them did about the after effects, I thought that would be a great story for North Carolina to run. So I mentioned that to Will, and he did a great story. We interviewed people in the community, but talking about the numbers and the data. But you should think about it in terms of find the people in the story, find the narrative, and we're always open to that. So we had a couple more. One, okay, Will.
I want to add one thing, and then not a question. I just want to express very sincere thanks to all of you for the work you've done for North Carolina. I doubt you get thanked enough. I know you get plenty of criticism, and as someone who depends on you know, truth being told to people who make decisions, your work is invaluable. So thank you.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up, because we do have our keynote speakers coming up, and we're not going to take a break in between, so we need a few minutes to get set for that. But thank you all for coming and for your questions and your interest in what we do and environmental justice.